Before we build the endpoints for game state and start a round, we will need to create several helper functions that will assist to encapsulate logic to reutilize in each endpoint. We will see how to use a data transformation using an editor, create a function to obtain the last round, another to obtain the game associated topic, among others. Before we start building a data transformation element, let me explain why we're choosing this route. Blazedpath database engine allows to obtain the values from tables, and since for any useful operation we require to use the table relations that are explicit through the foreign keys, we are going to use these elements to obtain the linked data very easily. For example, if we wanted to extract information from a game, we could also return the information associated with the game topic. And by could, we mean that by default, the engine only returns information of only the table we are doing the query against. So if we want to return information related to the foreign key, we need to do a little extra work. And we can do this via a transformation. The transformations we are going to build will be used in the getLastRound function that we will be building later on. It will obtain the last round of the game and the associated quiz information as well. We will start by creating a helper folder. And inside we will right-click, New, and Transformation. And we name it Transformation Round with Quiz. A visual editor with two boxes will open. The left one is the source, while the right one will be the target. In the source, we are going to pick the table from the database found in quizesdatabase.round. And we can identify the table with the prefix quizzes database. As we move on building different parts in Blazedpath, we will see that in order to identify what a system, a data type, function, or any other element is from, we can do so by looking at the prefix with the system name it belongs to. That name was the one we established in the connection through the architecture diagram and can be modified there. In the target, we will select the round data type that, since it's defined in the same system, in this case the microservice, will not use any prefix. Since we want to incorporate useful quiz information, we are going to expand on the quiz attributes in both boxes. Now we are going to connect each of the attributes of the table with the data of our type. In this case, no further action is needed. We should mention that we can use blockies to make more complex transformations, making calls to functions, operations, and we can even call other transformations. A full spec of all the possibilities can be found on the Blazedpath docs. Now we are going to start with the implementation of the getLastRound function. This one will receive the game ID and will return the last round associated with the game. We also want to return the round quiz, so we need to use the transformation we just created. We drag the return blocky and we will build the database select, explaining the expression step by step. If we start typing RDS, we can see a list of relational database functions we can use. For this one, we are going to use RDS select. Again, more information on these functions can be found in the documentation. Now we select what table we want to query, in this case the round table. The next two parameters are going to be the field selector and the conditions for the query. These parameters will create new contexts in the call where we will have access to the fields of the database register. This is very important to know because if we need to make a reference to parameters from the function and not the table, we need to let Blazedpath know we wish to make a context change so we can actually read them. For this, we will use the circumflex character like the one we are about to show. The next parameter is the selector of the fields we want to return on this query. We can use a list of fields or the whole register. In our case, we want all of them, so we are going to use the self-referencing function this. After that, we need to provide the condition. In our case, it's the game ID column that will be equal to the game ID parameter we got as the function parameter. Like we just mentioned, we are going to use the circumflex to let the expression know there is a context change and that the second game ID is not the table field, but the function parameter. The next parameter is the ordering criteria. As we know, the primary key is the round ID for this table, which is auto-incremental, so we want the last round. We will be using descending round ID criteria with the RDS desc function. We can beautify the code so it's easier to read. The next parameter is used for paginations and is the offset for the results, and the offset for the very start is 0. Lastly, we want to show how many results are going to be in the return page, so we will use a 1 since we just want one register. This select will return a list in which there will be only one register, but since we are going to require the quiz information as well, we are going to actually be using the transformation we just created and adapt the code we just wrote. The first adaptation is to call the transformation function, and as the first parameter, we have the transformation element we just configured. The autocomplete offers us a list of the available ones, so we just select the one we just created named transformation round with quiz. The second parameter is a reader that will provide the data source for the transformations. So we will use a special select of the reader kind, and it's called RDS select reader. The signature is almost the same as the RDS select, with the only exception being that we don't need to select any column, as the full register will be passed to the transformation, so we can delete that parameter. This code will return a list of rounds with the applied transformation on each element and will incorporate the quiz associated to each round. Since we want to return the first and only element of the list, we are going to encapsulate the whole call on a first function to extract the first object on the list. So finally, this one line of code is the full implementation of this particular function. Now let's continue with the implementation of the getTopicName function. This one will receive the game ID parameter and will return a string with the topic name associated with the game. In this case, we will use the rds select1 function, which returns the first match directly. We choose the table and the selector parameter. We will choose to return topic.name. As you can see through the game table, we are accessing the topics table through the relation that we established in the database design. Now let's open the game table and we can see the alias we called topic, and it's through this alias that we are accessing the topic table from the game table. And from this table we are going to get the topic name. Since we can use the aliases in this manner, traditional joins in SQL language will not be necessary, since Blazedpath's engine will solve these relationships. Lastly, the condition for the expression will be the same for the getLastRound function, meaning that the game ID column must be equal to the game ID parameter, called with the circumflex, of course. And we can now mark this function as completed. Now for another helper, we are going to call this one getRoundsPlayed. This helper will receive a game ID and will return an integer with the number of rounds that were already played for this game, not taking into account the current unfinished round. So we add a return blocky. We write on the expression rds select1 function, then round table, and as a select, we want it to count the total number of rounds with the count function. This would be the equivalent in the SQL language to make a select count asterisk. Next, we will write the conditions, and until now we were only using one search conditions, but we can use many. The only difference is that we need to pass all the conditions in brackets separated by commas. Here we are going to use the game ID equals to the circumflex game ID, and the completed rounds will have an end time value in the record, so in our other condition we will check for the end time field to not be null. We can do that with the isNotNull function. And with this expression, we have this helper completed. Now for the round-ended function, we are going to return a Boolean flag that represents if the round has finished. This is a very simple function, and we will return true if there is no round or if the end time field contains a value. So let's use a return blocky, and in the expression we write isNull of round or isNotNull of round dot end time. Another helper we need to create will be the pickRandom function. We will use this function on the getRandomQuiz one we are going to be writing next. This function will receive a list and will return a random element. To manually specify the type, we click on the input manually and we introduce list parentheses any and we close parentheses. we are going to call the element add function with the list as the first parameter, and as the second parameter it's going to be a random name between 0 and the amount of elements in the list, -1. We can do this through the random function that returns a value between 0 included and 1 not included, multiplying it by the amount of elements in the list and taking the natural part of the number. To finish up, we will create the getRandomQuiz function that from a game ID will get a random quiz that wasn't previously played. The first thing to do is to create a local variable where we will store the game ID named game of type game. We will also create a list of integer that will represent the quiz identifiers that were played, and we are going to name it quiz IDs played. Now let's start our logic by retrieving the game and then a list of all the quizzes IDs that were inserted in the rounds table, which coincide with all the played quizzes. We also create another variable, a list of integers, with all the IDs of available quizzes to choose from randomly. And we are going to name it available quiz IDs to pick. So we drag a set blocky and then we select the variable available quiz IDs to pick. In essence, this is a list of all the quizzes of a certain topic that are not in the already played list stored in the quiz ID played variable. This RDS conditional function will execute the first parameter or expression as long as the second parameter is true. In this case, we will apply the RDS not in function if the list quiz IDs place is not empty. Now let's randomly extract an ID from the list, and for that we create a new integer variable called random quiz ID. We validate that the list is not null, Otherwise, we call the pick random function we just created, passing the available identifiers list. And lastly, we return the quiz using the getQuiz function, originally created by the wizard, passing on the random ID we just picked. With this, the function to obtain a random quiz is done, and in the next video we will continue to create the game state and start round functions.